Hello everybody, my name is Pan Pantiaka. I'm Program Director of Drug Repurposing at the Anti-Cancer Fund, and I'm very happy to be here today to talk about Propanolol in Angiosarcoma. And I'd also like to thank the organisers for inviting me and giving me the chance to tell this story, which I think is quite an interesting one. Let me start by explaining who the Anti-Cancer Fund are, as I'm sure it's not quite so well known in the US. We are a European not-for-profit research foundation based in Brussels. And what we do is we support the development of new cancer therapies where there's not really much commercial interest. In addition to that work, we provide science-based information direct to cancer patients. So we have a service called My Cancer Navigator where patients can approach us directly. And despite being based in Brussels, our project funding for trials and so on is not based on geography. So we support trials wherever they might be based. We have some focus areas in particular, and obviously drug repurposing is one of those. We support clinical trials, particularly in those cancers where there are really high unmet needs, so rare cancers, for example. Aside from the My Cancer Navigator service, we also focus on other kinds of patient information. So, for example, exposing fake cancer cures on the internet and so on. And we also do a lot of health research and policy work, particularly as it impacts clinical trials and drug repurposing. And if you'd like to know more, please take a look at our website and our annual report. So let's talk about Propanolol. It's the original beta blocker drug from the 1960s, a non-selective beta blocker, still widely used, and it's included in the World Health Organization list of essential medicines. The original on-label uses were hypertension and angina, but since then it's been repurposed many times. It's used for arrhythmias, anxiety, migraine prophylaxis, many different disease areas. And we think possibly also in the future a treatment for angiosarcoma and other cancers via perioperative therapies. And before that, though, let me talk about one example of repurposing that's already been successful, and that's infantile hemangioma, which is an example of a really successful commercial repurposing exercise. So let's look at that. So hemangioma, it's a benign condition, though still quite distressing. It causes vascular malformations, as you can see from these pictures. And the standard treatment for this was NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, and corticosteroids. And sometimes these treatments, the corticosteroids in particular, could cause side effects. And doctors treating a child who was suffering these side effects decided to treat the child for the side effects with Propanolol. And much to their surprise, once the treatment commenced, very quickly the hemangioma regressed considerably. This took everybody by surprise, I think. The doctors then repeated this in other children to the same effect. And then they did something really rather good, which was to publish their findings. These were incidental, but they published them. And of course, that meant that other doctors could look at those case reports and attempt the same thing in their patients, leading to a number of clinical trials, and eventually a large randomized controlled trial which showed that Propanolol was an effective treatment for infantile hemangioma. Now, obviously, Propanolol was developed for adult diseases, and there was a case to be made for reformulating this to make it child-friendly, which a drug company did. The reformulated drug is called Hemangiol, but it is basically propranolol in a syrup. And it was approved by the FDA and the EMA in 2014, and is an example of a successful repurposing exercise. So how does that work with angiosarcoma? Well, let's talk about angiosarcoma first. It's a very rare soft tissue sarcoma, which are themselves quite rare. The standard first-line treatments are high-dose chemotherapies, old-fashioned chemotherapy drugs like that, with surgery and radiotherapy as options, depending on the site. You can see from these charts, response rates are not especially good. Median PFS less than 5 months, median overall survival less than 10 months. And these results haven't changed over time. Results with newer agents, anti-angiogenic drugs, checkpoint inhibitors, so far have all been disappointing. So this is a disease that's really in need of some new options. And the obvious thing after hemangioma was, well, if it works in this benign vascular tumor, where else does it work? In 2012, a group did some in vitro work where they looked at different types of vascular lesions, benign and malignant, and demonstrated that the beta adrenergic receptors were active in a whole range of these lesions, including angiosarcoma. That was followed shortly afterwards by some work in vivo, where Brad Bryan and colleagues showed that in angiosarcoma and hemangioendothelioma, the beta adrenergic receptors were active, and that targeting these using propranolol had some activity. And they did this in canine and mouse cells. So these were the first in vivo results showing that in angiosarcoma, propranolol did have some activity. Fast forward to a couple of years, and we see the first of the case reports emerging in India, the first, but also other parts of the world, including case series in 2016. And again, what we have is case reports being published, interesting findings being shared, and the drug being used off-label. And also we can see that, the continuing exploration in preclinical work, looking for synergies with chemotherapies and other treatments. Forward a couple of years more, and we're in a situation where there's a huge amount of work being done on propanolol as an anti-cancer agent, which we summarized in a report in 2016. And at the Anti-Cancer Fund, we took this information, we summarized the case reports or the literature data that we had, and took this to the European Medicines Agency, and achieved an orphan drug designation for soft tissue sarcoma. So another step towards making propranolol a possible treatment in angiosarcoma. Around the same time in the UK, there was some work around looking at legislation to address some of the issues around drug repurposing for generics, where there are a lack of incentives. And out of that failed attempt at legislation, there was a series of roundtable meetings at the Department of Health, hosted by the Association of Medical Research Charities. And there were some ideas about how we could tackle some of these problems with incentives. And we came up with the idea of doing a couple of test cases where generic drugs were taken for scientific advice at the UK regulator, the MHRA, and propranolol and angiosarcoma was one of those. This was a bit of an eye-opener in that for the repurposing world, the idea of going to scientific advice wasn't particularly well used. And together with the feedback we got at the Orphan drug designation at the EMA and the MHRA, we could see that although the case reports were good, that they gave us more than enough for a strong hypothesis. There are also issues. The different case reports use different dosing. There were different patient populations, so some were first line, some were recurrent. Different drugs were used in combination, sometimes metronomic chemotherapy, sometimes anthracyclines or paclitaxel, and it was unclear still what the degree of single agent activity was for propranolol and angiosarcoma. There was a single clinical trial in France looking at this, but it was a dose-finding trial which was not really powered and not really looking for evidence of efficacy. So here we are, fast forward in a few years. There is a window of opportunity trial in Europe looking at the single agent activity in angiosarcoma. It's in cutaneous angiosarcoma patients with a fixed dose of the drug. So we're looking to answer some of those questions that were raised. There is still ongoing preclinical work. Lots of people are studying the drug in different cancers. We still see case reports being published. And of course, there's a question now about not just synergy with chemotherapy, but what about checkpoint inhibitors and other immunotherapies? But despite these points, angiosarcoma is an orphan disease. Running large clinical trials is difficult in this kind of patient population, and despite the lack of on-label use, we are starting to see propanolol being listed in guidelines as a possible treatment for this disease. And of course, other cancers. I mean, I've focused on angiosarcoma because it's a really good example, but the effects of propranolol are not tissue specific. And so there's lots of work going on looking in other cancer types, and also as a possible treatment at the time of surgery as a perioperative therapy, where there's some evidence that propranolol may stop the spread of metastatic disease after surgery. So it's definitely a high profile drug candidate to watch in drug repurposing. And that's where we are. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.